The fire in the center of the circle cracked loud enough to make 300 people flinch, but Elena Ward did not move. She stood at the center of the choosing ground, with her wrist bare and her collarbone marked, the pale line of a half-formed bond glowing faintly under her skin. Everyone in the pack was watching her. Everyone was watching him. Damian Cole, the alpha king of the Coldridge pack, stood 2 feet away from her, close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off him, close enough that the bond between them pulled at her chest like a hook under the skin. He had not said a single word since the elders had called them both forward. He was not looking at her face. He was looking somewhere past her shoulder, at the tree line, at anything that was not her. Then he spoke. "I reject you as my mate." The words landed in the clearing like a stone dropped into still water. There was no explanation before them, and no softness around them. He did not lower his voice. He said it the way he announced border patrols and battle plans, flat and final, meant to be heard by every wolf standing in that circle. Elena felt the bond snap. It did not break slowly. It tore, all at once, a physical thing, like a rope pulled taut and then cut with a blade. Her knees wanted to buckle, her throat wanted to close. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped, and somewhere else a man muttered something under his breath that sounded like pity. She did not cry. She had promised herself, standing there in the firelight with 300 pairs of eyes on her, that she would not give him that. Whatever else he took from her tonight, he would not take the sight of her falling apart in front of his pack. Elena lifted her chin. She looked at Damian once, and only once, long enough to see that his jaw was tight and his eyes were doing something complicated, something that was not quite regret and was not quite relief, something caught between the two, like a man standing on a bridge that was already burning behind him. She turned around. The walk out of the circle felt longer than it should have. The crowd parted for her, silent, unsure whether to look at her or away from her. She kept her spine straight and her steps even, and she did not look back, not once, not even when she heard Damian's beta say something low and urgent to him, not even when she heard the murmur that followed her like a current. By the time she reached the tree line at the edge of the choosing ground, the fire was nothing but a flicker of orange behind her, and the sound of the pack was nothing but a hum swallowed by the trees. She kept walking until the hum disappeared completely. Damian did not follow her. He told himself, standing in the clearing with the eyes of his pack still on him, that he had done the only thing a king in his position could do. The Blackthorn pack had been circling Coldridge territory for 3 months, testing the borders, waiting for a weakness they could exploit. A newly formed mate bond was exactly that kind of weakness. An alpha distracted by love was an alpha who made mistakes, and mistakes in wartime were paid for in bodies. He had rejected Elena to protect her, to protect his pack, to protect the version of himself that could not afford to be anything less than in control. That was what he told himself. He did not let himself think about the look on her face before she turned around. He did not let himself think about how she had not begged him to explain, had not asked him why, had simply accepted the rejection and turned her back on him like a door closing. A part of him, the part he pushed down hardest, had expected tears, had almost wanted them, because tears would have meant she still needed something from him, still saw him as someone worth breaking down in front of. She had given him nothing. His beta, a broad-shouldered man named Nathan who had served the Cole family since Damian was a boy learning to shift, waited until the crowd began to disperse before he stepped close enough to speak without being overheard. "You know who her family is," Nathan said. It was not a question. "I know her name," Damian said. "That's enough." "It's not," Nathan said. "Elena Ward is the last unclaimed descendant of the old Ward line. Her bloodline hasn't produced an heir in 2 generations. A mating between her and you would have doubled our territorial claim across the eastern ridge, the same ridge Blackthorn has been testing for months. You didn't just reject a woman tonight, Damian. You rejected the one alliance that would have made this war impossible for them to win." Damian said nothing. The fire popped again, sending a spray of sparks into the dark. "And there's something else," Nathan added, quieter now. "Her wolf. I've never seen a match like it. Not in 30 years of serving this pack. Whatever you felt when that bond was forming, I don't think you're going to feel it again. Not with anyone." Damien turned and walked away before Nathan could say anything more. That night, alone in his quarters at the top of the Coldridge Lodge, Damien did not sleep. His wolf paced under his skin, restless in a way it had never been before, snapping at a bond that no longer existed, howling internally for something it had already lost. He told himself it would pass. Wolves adjusted. Kings adjusted. He had built an entire life on the belief that duty came before feeling, and he was not going to abandon that belief now because of one difficult night. He did not know, lying awake and listening to his own heartbeat, that Elena was 3 miles outside pack territory by then, walking along an empty road with her boots crunching gravel and her arms wrapped around herself, not out of grief, but out of the cold. She had not looked back at the lodge lights fading behind her. She had already decided, somewhere between the choosing ground and the edge of the territory line, that she was not going to spend one more hour of her life waiting for an explanation Damien Cole clearly had no intention of giving her. She reached the edge of a small human town by sunrise. She found a diner with its lights already on, ordered coffee she didn't really want, and sat by the window watching cars pass on a road that had nothing to do with packs, or bonds, or kings who rejected women in front of crowds. For the first time in years, nobody in the room knew her name, or her bloodline, or what she was worth to anyone's territorial map. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and empty, and Elena understood, staring into her coffee, that the ache under her ribs was not going to disappear just because she had walked far enough away from it. The bond had been severed, not healed. It would take more than distance to make peace with what had been taken from her without her consent, in front of an audience, by a man who had never once asked her how she felt about any of it. She finished her coffee. She paid with the small amount of cash she had brought with her, the only preparation she had made for a night she somehow already knew, deep down, was coming. Then she walked out into the morning and did not look back at Coldridge territory again. Behind her, in the lodge at the top of the ridge, Damien Cole stood at his window watching the sun rise over land his family had ruled for 3 generations, and felt, for the first time in his life, that he had won a battle and lost something he did not yet have a name for. By midweek, the entire pack knew that Elena was gone. Not banished, not exiled, simply gone, the way water disappears into dry ground. Nathan reported it to Damien with the flat professionalism of a man delivering unwelcome intelligence. She had not returned to her family home. She had not registered with any allied pack. She had, as far as anyone could tell, walked out of the supernatural world entirely and folded herself into the human one, where wolves rarely bothered to look. Damien told himself this was for the best, a clean break. No lingering ties to complicate the war effort, no whispered accusations that the king had shown weakness by keeping a rejected mate close. It was tidy. It was exactly the outcome he had engineered. He told himself that every day for the next 2 weeks, and every day it became a little harder to believe. The Blackthorn pack, emboldened by rumors of instability inside Coldridge leadership, pushed harder against the eastern border. Skirmishes broke out along the ridgeline, small at first, testing patrols meeting testing patrols in the dark. Damien led the response himself, throwing himself into strategy and defense with the same intensity he had once reserved for a war he no longer fully believed he could win on strength alone. His wolf did not settle. If anything, it grew worse, snapping and restless in ways that made even seasoned pack members give him a wider berth than usual. He caught himself, more than once, standing at the window of his quarters looking east, in the direction Elena had walked, as though some part of him still expected to see her coming back up the ridge. She never did. And somewhere in a small apartment above a bakery, 3 towns away from anything that smelled like pack politics, Elena Ward was learning how to build a life out of the pieces Damien Cole had left her with, one quiet, unremarkable day at a time, refusing, with every breath, to let the ache under her ribs decide who she was going to become. The apartment above the bakery smelled like cinnamon every morning by 6 o'clock, and Elena had come to find comfort in that smell in a way she never expected. It was a small space, one room and a narrow kitchen and a window that looked out over a quiet street lined with maple trees. Nothing like the sprawling lodge she had grown up around, nothing like the choosing ground where her old life had ended in front of a crowd. She liked it that way. Nobody here knew the name Ward. Nobody here understood what a mark on a collarbone meant, or cared that hers had gone from glowing to faded to a pale scar that only she ever noticed. She found work at a small accounting office 2 streets over, run by a woman named Grace Bellamy, who asked no questions about gaps in a resume and seemed to sense, without ever saying so directly, that Elena was someone rebuilding rather than someone starting fresh by choice. Grace was human, sharp-tongued, and had a habit of bringing in extra pastries from the bakery downstairs whenever she thought someone in the office looked like they needed one. She brought Elena pastries often during that first month. "You've got a look about you," Grace said one afternoon, setting a paper bag on Elena's desk without being asked. "Like you're carrying something heavy and trying not to let anyone see the weight of it." Elena had almost laughed. Almost. "It shows that much?" "Only to people paying attention," Grace said. "Most people don't pay attention. I do." Elena did not explain the bond, or the ceremony, or the man who had said 6 words in front of 300 people and changed the entire shape of her life. She did not explain any of it to anyone, not to Grace, not to the handful of co-workers who occasionally invited her to lunch, not to the neighbor down the hall who left a spare key under a flower pot in case Elena ever locked herself out. She simply lived, day after day, letting the ordinary rhythm of human life smooth over the edges of what had happened to her. It was not that she had stopped feeling it. The ache was there most mornings, a dull pull under her ribs that reminded her, whether she wanted the reminder or not, that somewhere a bond had been severed rather than allowed to grow. But she had made a decision, standing in that diner on the morning she left Coldridge territory, that she would not build her days around a wound. She would let it exist quietly, and she would build a life around it instead, brick by brick, until it took up less space than everything else she was becoming. She started running in the mornings before work, long loops through the maple-lined streets that let her wolf stretch in a way that felt safe, controlled, hers. She started reading again, novels with nothing to do with packs or politics, stories about people who had never heard the word alpha in their lives. She started, slowly, to laugh at things that had nothing to do with proving she was fine. She simply was, in small and unremarkable ways, becoming fine. 3 towns away, Damien Cole was not. The skirmishes along the eastern ridge had grown into something closer to open conflict by the time a month had passed since the choosing ground. Blackthorn scouts had been caught twice inside Coldridge territory, and twice Damien had ordered them released rather than punished, a decision his own council quietly questioned, sensing in it a hesitation that had not existed in their king before. Damien told himself he was being strategic, avoiding an escalation the pack could not yet afford. He did not tell himself, because he refused to look at it directly, that a rejected bond dulled a wolf's instincts in ways no strategy manual accounted for. His nights were the worst of it. He had expected the discomfort to fade, the way most difficult things faded, given enough time. Instead, it sharpened. His wolf paced through his dreams, snapping at a bond that no longer existed, chasing a scent that grew fainter with distance, and never disappeared entirely. He woke most mornings feeling as though he had run for miles in his sleep and arrived nowhere. Nathan noticed, before anyone else dared to. He had known Damien since Damien was a boy too young to control his own shift, and he recognized the particular hollowness in his king's eyes for what it was, even if Damien himself refused to name it. "You're not eating enough," Nathan said one evening, setting a plate down in front of Damien that had gone untouched for the better part of an hour. "And you haven't slept a full night since the choosing ground. Your council has noticed. I've noticed. Even the younger wolves are starting to whisper about it." "I'm managing a war, Nathan," Damien said. I don't have time to worry about how I look at dinner." "You're not managing a war," Nathan said. "You're surviving one, badly, because you cut off the one thing that would have made you strong enough to actually win it." Damien's jaw tightened. "That decision is done. There's no use revisiting it." "Is it done?" Nathan asked, quiet now. Not unkind, but unwilling to let the question go unasked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the decision is very much still happening to you. Every single day." Damien did not answer. He pushed the plate away and left the room, and Nathan let him go, because there were some things a king had to arrive at on his own, no matter how plainly his beta could see the shape of them from the outside. It was another 2 weeks before the first real crack showed, and it showed in front of the entire council, which made it impossible to pretend it hadn't happened at all. A trade envoy from the Ashford pack had come to discuss terms of alliance against the growing Blackthorn threat, and the envoy, a sharp older woman named Hannah Prescott, had asked, without any particular malice, whether the rumors of a rejected mate bond were true, and whether that rejection had weakened Coldridge's standing enough to make an alliance with them a poor investment. Damien had answered evenly, the way a king was trained to answer difficult questions in front of witnesses, but his wolf, still raw and unsettled beneath the surface, had reacted to the question in a way his face could not fully hide, a flicker of something too close to pain for a room full of political observers to miss. Hannah Prescott had noted it. She said nothing further in the meeting, but Nathan saw her write something down in the small leather notebook she carried, and he understood, watching her do it, that word of Damien's unsteadiness was about to travel far beyond Coldridge territory. It reached Damien in the worst possible way 3 days later, through a report from a border scout who had overheard Blackthorn wolves discussing it openly at a supply post near the ridge. The Coldridge king, they said, had grown weak since rejecting his mate. His wolf was unstable. His judgment could not be trusted in a crisis. It was, in the crude language of wolves preparing for war, an opening worth exploiting. Damien read the report standing alone in his study, and for the first time since the choosing ground, he allowed himself, briefly, to think about Elena directly rather than pushing the thought away the moment it surfaced. He thought about the way she had looked at him once before turning around, not with tears, not with pleading, but with a kind of calm that had unsettled him more than any amount of crying could have. He thought about the fact that she had not looked back, not once, in the entire time it took her to walk out of the choosing ground and disappear from every report his people could gather. He had expected, somewhere in the quiet arrogance of being a king, used to being wanted, that she would eventually come back, that the bond, even severed, would pull her toward him the way it pulled him toward her, dragging her back into his orbit whether she wished it or not. It had not happened. She had simply built a life somewhere else and left no trace of wanting anything to do with him at all. That, more than the war, more than the council's growing unease, more than the whispered reports of his own instability, was the thing that kept Damien awake at night. He began, without fully admitting to himself what he was doing, to ask quiet questions about her whereabouts. He instructed a small team, under the guise of routine security monitoring, to track any sign of a ward bloodline registration in neighboring territories, human or otherwise. He told himself this was due diligence, a king ensuring no loose threads existed that Blackthorn could use against him. He did not let himself examine why his hands went unsteady every time a report came back with no new information. It took nearly 6 weeks before a single lead surfaced. A pack contact working near a small human town 3 territories east reported a woman matching Elena's description, working an ordinary job, living an ordinary life, showing no sign of pack involvement whatsoever. The report was thin, uncertain, easily dismissed as coincidence. Damien read it 4 times before he set it down. He told himself he would not act on it. He told himself, standing at his window that night looking east, the way he had looked every night since the choosing ground, that whatever he had done was done, and chasing after a woman he had rejected in front of his entire pack would only prove Hannah Prescott and every whispering Blackthorn scout correct about his instability. He told himself all of that, And then, 2 days later, under the same thin pretense of border business that did not exist, Damian Cole got into his vehicle and drove east, toward a small town he had no real reason to be visiting, chasing a version of the truth he had spent 6 weeks refusing to name out loud, even to himself. The town was smaller than Damian expected, the kind of place with one main street and a handful of shops that closed by 7, a bakery on the corner, with its lights still glowing gold against the early evening dark. He parked across the street and sat there for nearly 20 minutes before he made himself get out of the vehicle, telling himself the entire time that he was simply confirming a security report, nothing more, nothing that required an explanation to anyone, least of all himself. He saw her before she saw him. Elena came out of the accounting office at the end of the block wearing a plain coat and carrying a bag over one shoulder, laughing at something a coworker had said, her head tipped back slightly, her whole posture loose in a way Damian had never once seen it back at Coldridge, where she had always carried herself like someone bracing for the next demand made of her. Here, in this ordinary street, under ordinary streetlights, she looked like a woman who belonged entirely to herself. The sight of it hit him harder than the rejection ceremony had, harder than the bond snapping, harder than anything Nathan or Hannah Prescott or the Blackthorn Scouts had said about him in the weeks since. She was not surviving without him. She was thriving. He almost turned around and left without saying a word. He told himself later that would have been the wiser choice, the choice that preserved whatever dignity he had left. Instead, his feet carried him across the street before his mind had fully agreed to it, and he was standing on the sidewalk, close enough to catch her scent under the smell of cinnamon drifting from the bakery when Elena turned and saw him. Her face did not do what he expected. There was no shock, no flicker of longing, no crack in the composure she had worn walking away from the choosing ground. She simply went still, the way a person goes still when they see something they had already prepared themselves to see eventually, something inevitable rather than surprising. "You're a long way from your territory," she said. Her voice was even, almost pleasant, the tone she might use with a stranger asking for directions. "I needed to see you," Damian said, and immediately hated how thin it sounded out loud, after 6 weeks of silence, after everything that had happened between the rejection and this street corner. "You had your chance to see me," Elena said. "You had the whole pack watching while you did it." The co-worker Elena had been walking with excused herself quietly, sensing the shift in the air, and left the two of them standing alone on the sidewalk as the evening deepened around them. Elena did not invite Damian anywhere private. She simply stood there, arms loosely crossed, waiting for him to say whatever he had driven 3 towns to say. "I need to explain what happened at the ceremony," Damian said. "You don't owe me an explanation," Elena said. "You made that very clear when you decided I didn't need one, before you rejected me in front of everyone I've ever known." The words landed exactly where she intended them to land. Damian felt his jaw tighten, felt the old instinct to argue, to justify, to remind her that he was a king managing a war she knew nothing about. He pushed the instinct down. He had come here for something more honest than an argument he could win on technicalities. "The Blackthorn Pack was already testing our borders before the ceremony," he said. "I believed at the time that a mate bond would make me a target, make you a target, give them exactly the kind of weakness they needed to move against Coldridge. I thought I was protecting you." "You thought," Elena repeated. "You never asked me what I thought. You never gave me the chance to decide whether I was willing to accept that risk. You made the decision for both of us, alone, and you made it in the most public way possible, so that whatever happened next, I would have to carry it in front of everyone who has ever known my name." Damian had no answer for that, because there was no answer that did not confirm exactly what she was saying. He had made the decision unilaterally, certain in the way kings were trained to be certain, and he had never once considered that Elena might have wanted a say in her own future. "I was wrong," he said finally. The words felt foreign in his mouth, unfamiliar in a way that surprised him. He had apologized for small things before, tactical missteps, delayed responses, minor errors that cost the pack little. He had never apologized for something that cost another person everything. "I know you were wrong," Elena said, and for the first time since he had arrived, something in her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for him to hear the effort it took her to keep her composure. "I've known that since the moment you said it. Knowing it doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give me back the 6 weeks I spent rebuilding a life you tried to take from me without asking." She turned to leave then, and for a moment Damien thought this was how it would end, the same way the choosing ground had ended, with her walking away and him standing frozen, unable to find the words that might have stopped her. "Elena," he said, and something in his voice made her stop, though she did not turn back around. "I'm not asking you to forgive the ceremony. I'm not asking you to forget what I did, or pretend it didn't cost you something you can't get back. I only came here because I needed you to know that the decision was mine alone, and the mistake was mine alone, and whatever happens with the pack or the war or anything else, I needed you to hear that from me directly, not through a report or a rumor." Elena stood still for a long moment, her back to him, the bakery light glowing gold behind her. When she finally spoke, her voice had steadied again, careful and controlled. "You should go back to your territory," she said. "You have a war to manage. I have a life I built without you, and I intend to keep building it, whether you understand that or not." She walked away, and this time Damien let her go, standing on the sidewalk long after she disappeared around the corner, feeling the weight of everything he had not said settle into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He drove back to Coldridge that night with nothing resolved, no promise made, no bridge rebuilt, and yet something in him felt lighter than it had in 6 weeks, simply because he had finally said the thing he had been avoiding since the choosing ground. He did not know if it changed anything for Elena. He suspected, driving through the dark with the ridge lights finally coming into view ahead of him, that it might not have changed anything at all. What he did not know, arriving back at the lodge well past midnight, was that Blackthorn scouts had used his absence to push further into Coldridge territory than they had in months, testing a border left thinner than usual while their king had been 3 towns away chasing a woman who had already made her choice clear. Nathan met him at the gate, his expression grim in the torchlight. "They crossed the northern ridge while you were gone," Nathan said. "2 of our patrols were caught off guard. Nobody died, but it was close, and the council is asking where you were." Damien felt the cold reality of it settle over him immediately, replacing whatever fragile lightness he had carried back from that sidewalk conversation. He had left his pack exposed to chase something he had no right to expect resolution from, and now the very threat he had claimed to be protecting Elena from had used his absence against the people who depended on him. "Gather the council," he said. "I need a full report on the breach, and I need it before sunrise." Nathan studied him for a moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You found her, didn't you?" "That's not relevant right now," Damien said, though the tightness in his voice told Nathan everything he needed to know. "It's entirely relevant," Nathan said, "because whatever you found on that sidewalk, Damien, you came back different. Whether that's good or bad for this pack depends entirely on what you do with it next." Damien did not answer. He walked past Nathan into the lodge, already turning his mind toward maps and patrol schedules and the growing certainty that Blackthorn's aggression was no longer testing behavior but the opening moves of something far larger. Somewhere beneath that certainty, quieter but no less present, was the memory of Elena's voice telling him he should go back to managing his war, and the growing uncomfortable awareness that he did not know how to do that the way he used to. Not anymore, not after finally admitting out loud what he had done wrong. 3 days later, a Blackthorn envoy delivered a formal declaration to the Coldridge Border Patrol, the kind of declaration that left no room for further skirmishing or ambiguity. The Blackthorn Alpha, a broad and calculating man named Derek Voss, had grown tired of testing borders and intended, the declaration made clear, to press a full claim on the eastern ridge within the week, banking on reports of a Coldridge king too unsteady to mount an effective defense. Damien read the declaration standing in the same study where he had first read the report of Elena's location, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after weeks of avoidance, that whatever unresolved ache still sat beneath his ribs would have to wait. His pack needed him whole, or as whole as he could manage to be, and there was no more room left for hesitation. He called the council together that same evening and laid out a defense plan more aggressive than anything he had proposed in the 6 weeks since the choosing ground, drawing on instincts that had gone dull in his grief and were only now, under the direct pressure of an imminent attack, beginning to sharpen again. Nathan watched him work through the night with something like cautious relief, recognizing in his king's renewed focus a version of Damien that had been missing since the fire in the choosing ground first burned low. None of them knew, gathered around the war table with maps spread across it and torches burning low in their brackets, that 3 towns away, Elena Ward had woken that same night from a dream she could not fully remember, her hand pressed against her collarbone, the faded mark beneath her fingers suddenly warm in a way it had not been in 6 weeks, as though something on the other end of a bond she believed long severed had begun, very quietly, to call for her. Elena sat up in bed with her hand still pressed against her collarbone, the warmth beneath her fingers fading slowly, like a coal cooling after a fire had been put out. She told herself it was nothing, a strange dream, a trick of a mind that had spent 6 weeks refusing to fully process what had happened to her. But she had grown up around bonds long enough to know the difference between imagination and instinct, and what she had just felt was instinct, sharp and unmistakable, pulling towards something happening far away from her quiet apartment above the bakery. She did not sleep again that night. She sat by the window instead, watching the empty street below, running through everything she knew about bond mechanics, about the rare cases where a severed connection could still carry faint signals across distance under conditions of extreme danger. It was not common. It was not something she had ever expected to experience firsthand, but she could not shake the certainty settling into her chest that whatever she had felt was real and that it meant something was wrong. By morning, she had made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She called Grace, told her she needed a few personal days, and did not explain further. Grace did not press her, though the look she gave Elena on her way out of the office suggested she understood, in the vague way people understand things they are not told directly, that this was not an ordinary personal matter. Elena packed a small bag and took the first bus east, back toward territory she had sworn she would never willingly return to. The drive back into Coldridge Land felt different from the walk out of it had felt, 6 weeks earlier. Then, she had been leaving a place that had rejected her. Now, she was returning to a place that might need her, whether it deserved her help or not, and the distinction mattered more to her than she expected it to. She arrived at the outer checkpoint by early afternoon, and the patrol wolves stationed there recognized her immediately, their surprise evident despite their training. Word moved quickly through pack channels, and by the time Elena reached the lodge itself, Nathan was already waiting at the entrance, his expression a careful mixture of relief and disbelief. "You felt it too," he said, before she had a chance to explain anything. "Felt what, exactly?" Elena said. "I need to hear it plainly, Nathan. I'm not here to guess." "Blackthorn crossed the ridge 2 nights ago," Nathan said. "It was bad, worse than any of the skirmishes before it. Damien took a wound defending the northern line himself, when he should have let his commanders handle it. He's alive, he's healing, but his wolf has been unsteady for weeks, and I think whatever happened during that fight pulled something loose between the two of you that neither of us fully understands." Elena absorbed that information standing perfectly still, the way she had learned to absorb difficult things since the choosing ground, without letting her face give away more than she intended it to. "Take me to him," she said, "not because I've forgiven anything, because I need to understand what's happening, and I won't understand it standing out here." Nathan led her through the lodge, past pack members who stared openly, some with hope in their expressions, others with a wary uncertainty that suggested they had not fully decided what her return meant for the pack's standing. Elena ignored all of it, keeping her focus fixed ahead of her, until Nathan stopped outside a heavy wooden door and stepped aside without a word. Damien was sitting up in bed when she entered, a bandage wrapped across his ribs, his face paler than she remembered, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made the ache under her own ribs flare sharply, undeniably, for the first time in 6 weeks. "You came," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't come for you," Elena said, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was true. "I came because I felt something through a bond I believed was already severed, and I needed to understand why." "It's not fully severed," Damien said. "I've spoken with the pack healers since the wound. They believe rejection weakens a bond, sometimes to the point of dormancy, but it rarely destroys it completely, not when the match beneath it was as strong as ours apparently was. Extreme danger can wake it, briefly, on both ends." Elena moved closer, though she stopped several feet from the bed, unwilling to close the distance entirely. "That doesn't change anything you did," she said. "It doesn't erase the ceremony, or the 6 weeks of silence, or the fact that you made a decision about my life without giving me any voice in it." "I know," Damien said. "I'm not asking it to change any of that. I only wanted you to understand why you're standing here right now, because I think you deserve the truth of it, even if the truth doesn't make anything easier between us." Elena studied him for a long moment, taking in the bandage, the exhaustion carved into his face, the careful way he held himself to avoid aggravating the wound beneath his ribs. Whatever anger she had carried out of the choosing ground was still there, sharp and unresolved, but standing in that room, feeling the pull of a bond she had spent 6 weeks trying to convince herself was gone, she found she could not simply turn around and leave the way she had once before. "Tell me about the attack," she said instead, choosing the safer ground of practical information over the far more complicated territory of feelings neither of them had fully worked through. Damien told her, in careful detail, about Derek Voss's declaration, about the aggressive timeline Blackthorn had set for pressing their claim on the eastern ridge, about the toll the recent skirmishes had already taken on Coldridge's defenses. He did not soften any of it for her benefit, and Elena appreciated that more than she expected to, after months of being handled and managed and decided for, without consultation. "You need more than a defense plan," she said when he finished. "Derek Voss is testing weakness, and right now, your pack's greatest weakness isn't your border patrols, it's the story Blackthorn is telling about you, about a king too unsteady to be trusted. Reports and rumors are doing more damage than their scouts are." "I know that," Damien said. "I don't know how to undo it, not quickly enough to matter before they move." Elena was quiet for a moment, turning the problem over the way she had once turned over pack politics before she had walked away from all of it. "You undo it," she said finally, "by making sure the next thing Blackthorn hears about isn't a king in decline. It's a king who held his ground against everything, including a fight that started because of his own worst decision, and won anyway." "And you'd be part of that story," Damien said, watching her carefully. "Is that something you're offering, or something you're warning me not to expect?" Elena did not answer immediately. She thought about the diner on the morning she left, the quiet apartment above the bakery, the ordinary life she had built brick by brick out of the wreckage of the choosing ground. She thought about the warmth she had felt against her collarbone in the middle of the night, pulling her back toward a place she had sworn she would never willingly return to. "I'm not promising you anything about what happens after this is over," she said, "but I'm not going to stand by and watch a war go badly for people who never wronged me, just to prove a point to a man who already knows he made a mistake. That's not who I am, and rejecting me at that ceremony didn't change that, whatever else it changed." Damien held her gaze, something in his expression easing slightly, not relief exactly, but something close to it. "Then let me show you the border reports," he said. "If you're willing to look at them with me, I think you'll see exactly where Blackthorn intends to strike first, and exactly where we're going to need every advantage we can find to hold that line." Elena moved to the chair beside the bed and sat down, close enough now that the bond between them pulled steady and warm beneath her collarbone, an old ache transforming, slowly, into something she was not yet ready to name. Together, They bent over the maps spread across the small table beside the bed, and for the first time since the choosing ground, they worked toward the same outcome, side by side, without either of them pretending the 6 weeks between them had never happened. Outside the lodge, night fell over the ridge, and somewhere beyond the border, Derek Voss gathered his own commanders around a different table, confident that the Coldridge King he intended to face in 3 days' time was still the unsteady, grieving man his scouts had reported for weeks, with no idea that the woman who had walked away from that king without a single tear had just walked back into his life, not out of forgiveness, but out of a loyalty to something larger than either of their unresolved history. The 3 days before Derek Voss's declared attack passed faster than anyone in the lodge felt prepared for, each one filled with council meetings that ran late into the night, patrol reassignments, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding a defense strategy that had been quietly eroding for weeks under the weight of rumor and hesitation. Elena stayed. She did not move into Damien's quarters, did not accept the private rooms Nathan offered her in the family wing of the lodge, choosing instead a modest guest room near the healer's quarters that kept enough distance between herself and Damien to remind them both that nothing between them had actually been resolved. But she worked alongside him constantly, and pack members who had watched her walk out of the choosing ground without a single tear now watched her walk the length of the border maps with the same composed focus, offering insight into Blackthorn's likely movements that came from years of growing up around pack politics her own family had once been deeply embedded in. Nathan, watching the two of them bent over strategy tables late into the night, began to see a version of leadership in the room that had been missing since long before the rejection ceremony, something steadier than either of them had managed alone. On the second night, Damien found Elena standing alone on the lodge's east balcony, looking out over the dark ridgeline where Blackthorn forces were rumored to be gathering. He approached carefully, giving her every opportunity to send him away if she wanted to. "You should be resting," he said, instead of anything more complicated. "So should you," Elena said, without turning around. "Your ribs haven't fully healed." "They'll hold," Damien said. He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, not close enough to touch. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, whatever the answer is." She turned to face him then, her expression guarded, but not closed off entirely. "Ask. Why did you come back?" Damien said. "The bond woke something in both of us, yes, but you could have stayed exactly where you were and let your own healers confirm you were safe from a distance. You didn't have to walk back into a war that isn't yours." Elena was quiet for a long moment, the wind pulling at loose strands of her hair, the ridge dark and silent below them. "Because 6 weeks ago, you decided something enormous about my life without asking me," she said finally. "And for 6 weeks, I told myself the right response to that was to build a life so far away from you that it would never matter again what you decided about anything. But when I felt that pull in the middle of the night, I had a choice. I could ignore it, the way you deserved to be ignored after what you did. Or I could come see for myself what was actually happening and make my own decision about what to do with it, instead of letting fear or anger decide for me, the way your fear decided for you at that ceremony. So this is you taking back the choice I took from you," Damien said quietly. "Yes," Elena said. "Whatever happens after this war is over. I needed you to understand that I'm here because I chose to be, not because a bond pulled me here against my will, and not because I've forgiven what happened at the choosing ground. Those are two very different things, and I won't let you confuse them." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction with a seriousness that told Elena he understood, finally, the difference between an apology and genuine change. "I won't confuse them," he said, "and whatever you decide once this is over, I intend to earn it properly this time, not assume it, not decide it for you. Earn it, the way I should have from the beginning." They stood together at the railing in silence after that, the ache beneath Elena's collarbone steady and warm, no longer the sharp severed pain of 6 weeks earlier, though neither of them named what it had become instead. Some things, she had learned, were better left to sit quietly until they were ready to be understood. Derek Voss moved against the eastern ridge on the third night, exactly as his declaration had promised, and the assault came harder and faster than even Damien's revised strategy had fully anticipated. Blackthorn forces pushed across the border in 3 coordinated waves, testing Coldridge's northern and southern flanks simultaneously, before committing the bulk of their strength to a direct assault on the ridge's central pass, the same weak point Elena had identified during their strategy sessions 2 nights earlier. Damien led the central defense himself, his ribs still tender beneath layers of bandaging, his wolf finally steady beneath his skin in a way it had not been since before the choosing ground. Nathan commanded the northern flank, and a young but capable commander named Owen Whitfield held the south, both of them executing the defense Elena had helped shape with a precision that surprised even themselves. The fighting was brutal, close and chaotic in the dark, wolves and shifted warriors clashing along the tree line with a violence that neither side attempted to disguise as anything less than a battle for territory and survival. Damien fought at the center of it, his focus sharper than it had been in weeks, driven by a clarity that came from finally having something worth protecting again, beyond duty alone. It was nearly 2 hours into the fighting when Derek Voss himself broke through the central line, sensing an opportunity to end the conflict decisively by striking directly at the Coldridge King. Damien met him head-on, and the fight between them was fast and vicious, testing every advantage Damien's steadied focus could provide against an opponent who had spent weeks believing his enemy too broken to properly defend himself. Damien was wrong about one thing only, and it nearly cost him everything. He had assumed Derek Voss would fight with the same crude aggression his scouts reported along the border for months. Instead, Voss fought with a controlled, calculating precision that caught Damien off guard at the worst possible moment, driving a blow into his already wounded ribs that dropped him to one knee at the edge of the tree line. Elena, who had stayed near the healer's station at Damien's insistence, felt the injury through the bond before any messenger could have reached her with the news, a sharp, unmistakable pain that had nothing to do with her own body. She did not hesitate. She left the healer's station and ran toward the central pass, ignoring every instruction to stay back, driven by an instinct too strong to argue with. She arrived at the tree line just as Derek Voss moved to finish what his blow had started, and it was Elena's warning shout, sharp and commanding in a way that startled every wolf near enough to hear it, that gave Damien the half-second he needed to roll clear and regain his footing. She had not come to fight. She had no intention of engaging Blackthorn's alpha directly, but her presence at the edge of the clearing, unshaken and unafraid, reminded every Coldridge wolf still fighting exactly what they were defending, and the renewed surge of effort that followed turned the tide of the central pass within minutes. Derek Voss, sensing the shift and unwilling to lose more of his own forces chasing a victory that had slipped out of reach, sounded the retreat before Damien could press the advantage further. Blackthorn forces withdrew across the ridge as dawn broke over the tree line, leaving Coldridge territory bloodied but intact, and leaving Derek Voss with a far less certain read on the king he had believed too unsteady to properly defend his own land. Damien was carried back to the lodge with new injuries layered over old ones, and Elena did not leave his side through the long hours it took the healers to stabilize him, her hand resting against his, the bond between them steady and warm and undeniably alive in a way that made words feel unnecessary for a long while. When Damien finally woke, well into the following afternoon, Elena was still there, seated in the chair beside his bed, watching the pale light shift across the floor. "You shouldn't have come to the tree line," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have engaged Derek Voss directly with wounded ribs," Elena said. "We're even." Damien almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere in his chest. Half pain and half something lighter than pain had allowed him to feel in weeks. "Thank you," he said, quieter now. "Not just for the tree line, for coming back at all, when you had every reason not to." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching him carefully. "I'm not going to pretend the ceremony didn't happen," she said. I'm not going to pretend 6 weeks of silence didn't cost me something. I'm still figuring out how to name. But I watched you fight for this pack last night, the way you should have fought for me at the choosing ground. And I think that means something, even if I'm not ready to decide exactly what yet. I don't need you to decide anything yet, Damien said. I only need the chance to keep showing you, one day at a time, that I understand the difference now between deciding things for you and earning a place beside you. Elena did not answer immediately, but she did not pull her hand away from his either, and in the quiet that followed, filled only with the sound of the lodge slowly waking around them after the long night of battle, something new began to take shape between them, unhurried and uncertain, built not on the ceremony that had broken them apart, but on everything that had happened since, one honest choice at a time. In the weeks that followed, the pack watched Elena Ward move through Coldridge territory, not as a rejected mate returning in defeat, but as a woman who had walked away once already and chosen, on her own terms, to walk back. There was no second ceremony, no public reversal of the words spoken at the fire that night, no grand gesture meant to undo what had already been done in front of 300 witnesses. Some wounds, Elena had come to understand, were not meant to be erased. They were meant to be carried forward, carefully, until they became simply another part of the story rather than the whole of it. Damien never asked her to forget the choosing ground. He never suggested that a battle won or an apology spoken could fully repay what his decision had cost her. Instead, he showed up, day after day, in the small and unremarkable ways that mattered most, asking rather than deciding, listening rather than assuming, earning in slow, deliberate steps the trust he had once taken for granted he already had. And Elena, walking the ridgeline beside him one quiet evening months later, the ache beneath her collarbone, long since settled into something warm and steady rather than sharp, understood that she had never needed him to regret the rejection for her own sake. She had walked away without tears because she had refused, from the very first moment, to let his decision define what she was worth. Whatever came next between them, she intended to keep making that choice, for as long as it remained hers to make, and for reasons that would always, first and foremost, belong entirely to her.